The number one question I get asked on YouTube and in real life when people discover that I really like horror movies is, what's your favorite scary movie? For years, I was even hesitant to rank my top 5 favorites, but I always knew in my heart that it was Mary Lambert's 1989 Pet Sematary that had the top spot. The film not only has a unique way of combining psychological and paranormal aspects, it also talks about death, the thing that we all fear. It discusses our mortality, what we think of death, and also how we perceive death, aka Zelda. And with all the characters and aspects within the film, it's just the one that hits the top of my list. And although it is set in a stereotypical Stephen King setting, it is a universal message. It's about you and me and how fragile as human beings we really are, and how everyone we love will someday die. I give this movie a 10 out of 10 any day, even with the Pascal special effects. But with all of that said, what if I confess now that the Stephen King book is far superior? It legit gives me goosebumps. In this video, I'm gonna break down and nitpick some of the key differences between the book and the original movie, and I'm gonna tell you why we need to back off adaptations just a little bit. And yes, there will be spoilers within this video, but I do want to make it clear I'm only talking about the original 1989 movie. I'm not talking about the new adaptation. We're going to talk about that later. We're not going to talk about that in this video. We're going to keep it 100% spoiler free. The film hasn't come out at this point, and I just want to talk about this and kind of give you a refresher. Released in 1989, Pet Sematary has a runtime of 1 hour and 43 minutes. And it's a film with little breathing room. The story follows the Creeds as they arrive in their new home that backs onto a trail to a pet cemetery. But beyond the pet cemetery is where the story really lies. Behind the resting place for childhood pets is the old Micmac burial ground, which is said to be touched by the Wendigo, who has turned the ground sour, causing the dead who are buried there to rise again, but not as themselves. Throughout the film, the Creeds have several encounters with death, from their housekeeper Missy to Victor Pascal, their cat Church, and of course, their son Gage. But these aren't the only stories of death that are explored. We also have Zelda, Rachel's sister who died when she was a child from spinal meningitis. I'm sure you get the point, but there are so many aspects within this film that talk about the looming dread that is death and how fragile we all are. Of course, everything I just mentioned about the movie is based on the original book, and being a movie, it's bound to miss out on a lot of aspects, but it did keep a lot of the dialogue, character traits, and nods to the book. But to talk about the differences between the book and the movie, we need to talk about what's the same. I think something that the movie really nailed was the casting. The standouts to me are Blaise Birtle, who played Ellie Creed, Fred Gwynne, who plays Judd just amazingly, and of course, Andrew Hugh Baxter, who haunted our nightmares playing the memory of Rachel's sick sister Zelda. Birtle playing Ellie really brought Stephen King's words to life, with a visual representation of a vulnerable child understanding the concept of death. I don't know why, but sometimes I'm just amazed by child actors and what they can do. She is perfect. She is the annoying little girl from the book to a T. She got the dialogue down packed, and I really believe everything she says and all her curiosities. It's just amazing, especially when she's having the Shining-esque kind of flashes to Pascal. I don't know, it's uncanny. Judd is such an interesting character because I feel like the accent was really believable, and when they talk about him saying stuff like road, I can't say it in the American Yankee accent, he just pulls it off so well. But he's also very powerful and authoritative, I guess is the word, and he just mixes that really well. I just really like the dynamic between him and Lois, which in the book, there's a greater dynamic, but in the movie, you can easily see how they would have this kind of friendship. It's also really interesting with Judd because he had to carry his character without having Norma. In the book, he has a wife, and her death is really important into the story, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But the actor pulling that off and pulling us in without Norma, I thought was done in a really interesting way, especially because I will get to it, but we kind of needed Norma to carry things along, and I think that they did that really well without her. Zelda, can you think of anything more scary? I cannot think of much, to be honest, and I know a lot of people out there are still scared by Zelda and the idea of Zelda, and I think that that's where people get confused with how Zelda is portrayed. She is played by a man in this movie, but she's meant to be how Rachel perceives and her memories of Zelda, so she's not actually meant to be what she was, if that makes sense. So that's why it's so dreamy and memory-like when you see her, and I think that they pull that off really well. She's really creepy, and she's just, when you're a kid and you fear something, it just turns into a monster, and I think they did that really well. I'm not sure if this counts for characters, but I also think they pulled off Church really well, and I know that the actor who played Lewis Creed, he was quoted saying how bad it was working with the cat, and I think that they really showed that in the performance, and that's what was meant to be in the book, so it worked out really well. The last thing that is very similar between the book and the movie is the overwhelming feeling of dread which comes from both. It is just, I mean, the whole movie is about death, but the dread, the fear of the unknowing, but knowing it's just around the corner, I think it came through really well in the movie, although it's so packed out with information. It's a lot to take in because there's so many different characters, there's so many different aspects, and they're all really warranted. So I think that they did that in a really awesome way without some of the information that the audience isn't given. But let's get into some of the key differences. The biggest difference, I think, in the movie and the book is the Wendigo. The Wendigo is behind everything that happens in the book, and it's kind of like clued to the fact, where in the movie there is some weird special effects parts where, you know, the Wendigo is messing. There are some voices when he's walking up to the Micmac burial ground, but the Wendigo and the fact that it has turned things sour, it reappears in the book. It actually appears to Lewis himself within the house, and it's talked about the horns. Every aspect of the Wendigo is kind of explored, and I feel like that's missing in the movie, and I guess it gives it more of a realistic feel in the movie because it's more about just death, and it takes that little bit more of the paranormal aspect out of it. But I think it's a really interesting explanation of what's happening and why it's happening in the book, so that is probably the biggest difference. And off the back of that comes the lure, which is better explained in the book. It talks about the reasons why things happen in the movie and the book through the story, you know, Gage's death and, you know, him returning to the Micmac burial grounds. The lure is such a key part of it. The Wendigo and the effects, the obsession, the spiral, it's all explained in the book. But in the movie, I think it's kind of suggested that Lewis just goes back to the burial grounds because he is so desperate, where it's very much a pull from the lure and the obsession and the spiral. Did I explain that right? I don't know. I have consumed so much Pet Sematary within the last month. I feel like I'm going crazy. And of course, this would be all better explained if we weren't missing that one key aspect that the movie is missing, and that is Lewis's inner dialogue. With books, they have the means to jump from one person to another. With movies and inner dialogue, it's very different. They weren't going to have a voiceover throughout the whole freaking thing. That would have been ridiculous, especially with so many aspects, and it was just non-stop dialogue the whole time. It wouldn't make any sense. But in the book, it reveals Lewis and his dark sense of humor, and again, his intentions, his pull, his obsession, and that's the way of explaining it, which is so hard to do in a movie. You can't do that. As I said before, I did want to explain Missy and Norma and their difference in the book versus the movie. Missy's actually a combination of two characters that are in the book, and one of them is Norma, who Norma is Judd's wife. And Judd's wife is so important to the story because she is the reason this all happened. As you probably know, Lewis Creed is a doctor, and short story, he saves Norma's life at one point during the book. Norma does later die, but at that moment, Judd is internally grateful. So when Church dies, he feels like he owes it to Norma to do something nice for their family, and that's how he shows the burial ground. So that's why there's a conversation between Judd and Lewis in the movie where he says that, oh my gosh, I did this to your son, I killed your son. It's because when he shows him the burial ground, he sparks the lure and the Wendigo, and then from there on, it's a downfall, where I didn't really understand that sense of guilt when watching the movie, but again, It's explained very well in the book. And Norma's definitely used as more of a stepping stone, and you can see why people do certain things because of her. The last little nitpick I want to talk about is this insane moment in the book that is not in the movie, and is very much like Annihilation. We were talking about Annihilation and the bear and how it talks. This happens actually in the book with Gage, and the scene at the end where Gage goes and attacks Judd, he, in the book, says some really awful things. He says that his wife was a slut and a whore and that she liked it up the arse. And Gage actually uses the voice of Norma, opens his mouth gaping, and Norma's voice comes out. So this is more clear evidence that it isn't, you know, a living dead situation. It's not a reanimator. They're not zombies. It's more of the Wendigo talking through it, which I don't think is very clear in the movie. And I mean, it's not that clear in the book, to be honest, but that's what I'm getting out of it. That is the Wendigo who's actually controlling all these people. And I think in the book they make this a lot more clear and it's a lot more chilling. But how would they have done that in the movie? That would have been ridiculous. My favorite part of the book that couldn't have made it into the movie, there was no way, is this really interesting kind of conversation or just idea that is talking about Disneyland and Oz the Great and Terrible. If you guys have read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It discusses the idea of how no matter where you are in the world, you can drop dead, such as in Disneyland, and it really goes into great detail to drive the dread home. Revisiting this book, I definitely thought a lot about my own demise. So fun. But the movie still stands as one of my favorite horror films of all time. And at the end of it all, I'm just glad Stephen King created the story. It's bold and it's brave on its delivery, exploring some of the most disturbing parts of being a human that we don't even talk about with people who are close with us behind closed doors. And with all of that said, I can't imagine how hard it would have been to fit all of the detail, story, structure, characters from the book into a movie that's less than 2 hours. It's just impossible. There are so many moments that just can't be naturally adapted into a movie from a book. And I think a lot of people who really love a book, when they go to see the movie, they expect it to be the same thing, but it can't be. There's no way. And this is because when you read a book, you see it in your own mind. It's about using your imagination. But when something is visual, it's completely different. You don't have control anymore, and it can be a good thing. I love movies because it's there and it is up to your own interpretation, but what we see is all the same. And when you're reading a book, characters and places all play out a little bit different in your head, and that's what makes reading a book so special. It's just something to keep in mind when you watch movie adaptations of books that you really love. It's really hard to get it right, and you have to remember that the directors and filmmakers themselves have read the book and they know the message, so it's not you alone screaming it, but it's just so hard to translate a book that can use so many different means to explain the story into something that is visually, you can't just like cut around like crazy. It has to make sense. So we just have to remember that this is the portrayal that the filmmakers have of the book, and just enjoy it for that, and maybe lower your expectations. I hope that this was interesting in any way. I'm sure a lot of you guys have read the book or listened to the audiobook, or you've seen the movie and you wanted to know the differences. Just so you guys know, I read the book in 2008. I then have seen the movie, I don't even know how many times, maybe like 50 times. It's one of my favorite movies. And I watched it twice this month as well, just to refresh myself. And then I listened to the Michael C. Hall audiobook of Pet Sematary to refresh myself also. Would recommend, 10 out of 10. Best one I've ever listened to. My voice is going. I've spoken so much. I hope this was interesting. I don't do a lot of book versus movie comparisons because I'm very much a movie nerd, not so much a book nerd, but I respect the art. I hope you guys have a great day. If you did find it helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and why not subscribe if you're around. I can't wait to talk about Pet Sematary when it comes out, and we can go through those key differences once again if you want to. Please leave your thoughts on the original movie and the book down below. I love you guys very much. I'll talk to you guys very soon. Bye! And remember, sometimes dead is better.